Life Audio.
This is Chris, and this is a different episode of the Bible Study Podcast. It comes from a sermon that I gave at my home church, which is Bethel Lutheran Church in Cupertino, California, on June 16th. And the text for this is 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 34 through chapter 16, verse 13. And it's the calling of David by Samuel.
Good morning. Some of you know that I usually practice these sermons walking around the neighborhood, so I will warn you this is a 1-mile sermon. And I'm going to focus just on the Old Testament lesson, lest it becomes a 2-mile sermon, but fortunately Amanda covered the gospel lesson, so we don't have to go into that. So a couple months ago, Pastor Ben used the illustration in one of his sermons about that playground ritual. I don't know if you remember that sermon, where the people in your class would line up and you'd get 2 captains and they would pick, people for the kickball team. I was reminded of that ritual again here as we have David's sons lining up from oldest to youngest. And Samuel is going to pick not for a team, but pick a king. Now, Pastor Ben had a different recollection of that ritual on the playground than I did. He said he was usually picked first or second because he was a good athlete. I was really hoping not to be picked anywhere near the first or second position, but back more at the second to last or last position, which was appropriate expectations for my prowess as an athlete at that time. I was tall but gangly and uncoordinated. And expectations have a lot to do with this story of David, which we're going to get into in a bit. But first, let's set a little background for this story. The people of Israel have not always had a king. When they came into the promised land in Exodus and into the book of Joshua and Judges, God was their king. And occasionally they would forget God, they would screw up, they would start behaving like their neighbors, and God would raise up a judge who would set them straight and kick out whoever was oppressing them or whoever had invaded them, judges like Gideon or Deborah or Samson. And this went on until the last judge, who is Samuel, who is priest and the last of the judges. And early on in the book of 1 Samuel, the people come to Samuel and they say, we want a king. We want to be like everybody else. Forgetting that the way they got in trouble usually was being like everybody else. But God says, don't worry, Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. But go and name a king. And so he goes and he chooses Saul. And Saul looked like a king. Saul, we learn, was a head taller than everybody else. He was strong, and the people readily accepted him as their king. But Saul has screwed up by the time we get to this story. And he just screwed up in the beginning of chapter 15. We start in the end of chapter 15 because God has sent him to destroy the Amalekites. The Amalekites who waylaid the children of Israel on their way into the promised land. And God says, go destroy them completely, including their flocks and their herds. But as Samuel greets Saul as he comes back from this victory over the Amalekites, he says, why do I hear the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep? Because Saul and the people of Israel have brought with them the best of the flocks and the herds of the Amalekites, which they were not supposed to do. And Saul says, no, we're not being disobedient. We brought them back to sacrifice. Yeah, that's right, to sacrifice to God. And Samuel says something that echoes throughout the Old Testament prophets. He says, to obey is better than sacrifice. That God is looking for his people, and especially for their king, to be obedient, to be faithful, and that is more important than any particular ritual. And so Samuel, having been mourning for Saul, and God says, it's time to go pick another king. And he sends him to Jesse and says, I will show you from which of the sons of Jesse to name the new king. Now, God could have just said, go to Jesse, he's got a son David, anoint him as king. that wouldn't have been that complicated. The fact that God did not do that, I think, is intentional, and there's a lesson here in why God does that, which we see when Samuel gets here. We get the sons lined up from oldest to youngest, and Samuel looks at the oldest and says, "This guy looks like a king. He's tall. Didn't we just do that? Didn't we try that with Saul?" That, it turns out, is no more a good predictor of if he's going to be a good king than it was predicting if I was going to be a good kickball player. And God says, no, that's not the guy, because I look on people differently. I see what you don't see. I look on the heart. So Samuel goes to the next son. Not him. What about that guy? No. What about that guy? No. What about that guy? On down until he runs out of sons, which has got to be a little surprising for Samuel. And so you ask a question which makes sense to us because we know why he's there, and to Samuel, but probably is very curious to Jesse and his sons. Got any more sons? He said, well, yeah, there's David, but he's with the sheep. In other words, the prophet of God, the last of the judges, came to visit us, and we didn't think it was important enough for David to show up. So we left him with the sheep. Someone had to do it. So they send for David. They send for David. He comes back, and God whispers in Samuel's ear and says, that's the guy. And so they anoint David as king. Do you know what David does the very next day? Anybody? Go back to the sheep. David, we think, is probably about 15 at this point. David is not yet ready to be king. David won't be king of anybody in Israel for 15 years at the death of Saul and his son Jonathan, and won't be king of all of Israel till 7.5 years after that. So why are we here today? Why are we anointing David as king, this 15-year-old, today? It is clearly a bit premature. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is simply that Samuel is old. Samuel won't be there in 15 years. Samuel has seen Saul for the last time. And Samuel won't be there in 22.5 years when David will finally become king of all Israel. But I think the other reason is associated with that thing that God said when he looked at the oldest brother and said, I see things differently. I see people differently. Because if he had waited 15 years, 22.5 years later, it would have been obvious to everybody that David would make a good king. A lot has happened between 15-year-old David and 30-year-old David or 42.5-year-old David. David will, shortly after this, we don't know exactly when, Saul gets in a mood periodically. And they send for someone who will play the lyre or something to soothe him when he's in a mood, and they choose David. And after that, David fights a very well-known battle with a giant, Goliath, still using the tools of a shepherd because he's not a warrior. Saul tries to put him in his armor, and he says, I can't use this. I'm not a warrior. I'm a shepherd. But over time, David becomes a mighty warrior. David becomes a warrior such that it starts to put a rift between Saul and him. David is now, by this point, Saul's son-in-law. And the people start saying, Saul slays his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And at that point, if you had said to people, Samuel went and he anointed David as king, you'd go, sure. Okay, well, that makes sense. David, yeah. We know David. I could see that. But at this point, 15-year-old David, shepherd boy David, it doesn't make a lot of sense yet. But God sees something different when he looks at David. And I'm reminded in this story of Gates' law. Does anybody know Gates' law? This is not a biblical principle. This is named after Bill Gates. And Bill Gates said, famously, that people can get done a lot less than they think they can in 1 year, but a lot more than they think they can in 10 years. And 1 year from this story, David is probably still a shepherd. Even at the story of David and Goliath, his brothers say, "What are you doing here? Who'd you leave the sheep with?" David is still a shepherd. But 10 years from now, David is a mighty warrior. He is not who you thought he would be. And I've been thinking about this a lot. If I can get personal for a change, as I usually don't in these sermons, I have some interesting things going on in my life right now because, first of all, I'm retiring from the day job. I'm retiring at the end of this month on the 27th. And thank you. And so I am thinking of, what am I going to do? And I am aware of the fact, having lost my parents both this January. My dad was 34 years older than me and died at the age of 97, good ripe old age, that I probably have, best case, 34 years. If you think about the last two were kind of iffy for Dad, and he went down hills, maybe 32, good years, somewhere in that range, best case, right? So it makes you a little introspective as you're looking at what is, hopefully, the last third of your life. So that makes me a bit introspective, but the other thing that makes me a bit introspective is that I made some interesting decisions 19 years ago, July 2nd. I decided to start some things in my copious free time, and I started a podcast. I started a travel podcast. And then a year later, I started a Bible study podcast. And a year after I started each of those, I would say they made absolutely no difference in my life except I was busier. Wasn't like people started saying, "Chris, please come to wherever." That didn't happen until 5 years later. But 9 years after that, I had an interesting year, 2014. And I had in fairly quick succession an invitation to visit the White House, which came as a surprise. I got an opportunity to be paparazzi for the Pope for a day, which is a weird thing to have happened. I'll tell you about it over a hot dog. And then also the other strangest thing that happened that year is I learned that if you went to get a job at the Thailand Foreign Ministry, their version of the State Department, you needed to listen to 2 episodes of the Amateur Traveler podcast, and you were graded on your English comprehension. Very surprising. Very weird. Things you would not have predicted 9 years earlier. With the Bible study podcast, when I started that, I was speaking in a room by myself, doing a Bible study, and there was no one else there, and I would put it out into the void, out into the ether. And now, 18 years later, every day I teach a Bible study to roughly 3,000 to 4,000 people. So that, again, is unexpected. But there is something about the compounding effort of showing up, of doing things week after week after week. With the Amateur Traveler, I plan to do 48 shows a year. After 19 years, episode 900 is about to come out. Episode 870 of the Bible Study Podcast, I do one 48 weeks a year and one 52 weeks a year. But I shouldn't be that surprised, because there are other examples that I've seen. When I wrote the sermon, I was thinking of the quilters, that every once in a while I come into church, and to my surprise, there are quilts everywhere. Quilts on the walls and quilts in the pews and such. Turns out this is one of those Sundays. I did not know that. If you go into the sanctuary afterwards, you'll see quilts everywhere. And I will bet that these quilts were not all made one Monday. Right? How were that many quilts made? Because people showed up one Monday and did some sewing, and then the Monday after, and then the Monday after, and then the Monday after that, and kept coming, and were faithful to a calling that they had received. And I think of Mission to Mexico. How many of you have been on Mission to Mexico? Few hands. Ralph will back me up with this. I know you've been there many times. You start up the mixer. You pour in some concrete, some water, some sand, and some gravel. You mix it for a while, and then somebody stronger than me, usually, somebody who was picked probably closer to the beginning of the kickball team, takes 2 shovels full of cement and puts it in a bucket, and you pass that bucket hand to hand, and you throw it into what's going to be a floor or walls or a roof of somebody's house. And I'll tell you, that first bucketful, when it hits the floor, looks completely insignificant. It's so little cement. But you keep going. And the mixer runs, and the buckets pass, and you fill up the mixer again and again and again. And by the end of the day, somebody has a new floor or walls or roof, and you have gone through something like 25 to 30 loads of concrete, which is, if you do the math, somewhere between 6 and 8 tons of concrete, passed 2 shovels full at a time, 1 bucket at a time, from hand to hand to hand, and placed. Being faithful over time adds up, and it accrues. Now, as I think of this story of 15-year-old David, I am pleased to report that God does not just call 15-year-olds, but he does. God also calls those who it looks like are pretty much done with their usefulness, like Abraham and Sarah. God also calls people that looks like they'd be an odd fit, like teachers who are fishermen, like Peter and James and John and Andrew. And God even calls those who it looks like society should be done with, murderers like Moses, to be his messenger. But my encouragement this week is, at whatever age you are called by God to whatever task you are called to show up. Week after week after week, stitch after stitch after stitch, or bucketful after bucketful after bucketful, and you will be amazed what God can do with the person he saw when he looked at you and called you. Amen.
I want to take just a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on this podcast. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.
In a recent survey, parents reported that 52% of homeschooled children need learning accommodations. These parents need practical advice, encouragement, and hope to fuel their homeschooling efforts. The Empowering Homeschool Conversations podcast is where parents gain wisdom on how to teach unique learners successfully at home, like Laura, who recently told us, "I needed this episode. I don't need a fancy curriculum or need to be a special ed teacher to teach my son. You have given me hope." To listen now, go to Life Audio or search Empowering Homeschool Conversations on your favorite podcast app.